Hi, this is David Daugherty, the master of the Ohio Lodge of Research. I sit down again with our senior warden, Chad Kopenski, our junior warden, Mike Miller, and past master, Taylor Kleineick, as we discuss the topic of how do we start Masonic research. Question that was posed was how do you start? And I very intentionally put in and finish research. Open-ended question. Whoever wants to take a first stab at it. How do you come up with your ideas for research topics?
All right, guys. What was the first research presentation you guys did, either for the OLR or for your own lodge? Do you remember the first one you did?
I don't think so.
My first one was it was actually the paper that I presented for to gain active status in OLR, and it was more of a historical perspective on Most Worshipful Brother Nelson Williams. And he was a very prolific Mason. He was the grand officer of virtually, I think, every office or every organization in Ohio, and including the National Grand Encampment or whatever for the, anyway. Yeah. So he was very prolific.
So, but I have to ask, what was it about that dude that made you, why was that the question you asked?
For me, he is a past master of my lodge, and there is a picture hanging of him as his grand master's portrait hanging in our building. And I could just tell by the way it was presented that there was something significant there. And I had heard these rumors at the time of how prolific he was, but in all of the different bodies of Masonry, as well as internationally through his participation and his involvement in other jurisdictions, that it just seemed to me that it was a story that if I had questions about it, if I was curious about it, it was a story that needed to be told.
So it started off with basically, you want to know something and you want to know why it's important. Isn't that kind of where you went with?
Yeah.
The first one I ever did was kind of the same way. And I guess when I start a project now, I don't know, I used to be much more methodical, but I think as I've gotten used to doing sort of and knowing how my own process works, I sort of gloss through things. At first I start off with the what and the why. Like, what is it I really want to know? And then I got to figure out why it's important to me. Why I can go and the question I have is there's a past Grand Master in my lodge. Same thing. Like, who's this dude in my lodge? Why is that picture there? And so I had to start off with what is he? Why is he? What is that? And then I had to figure out, why is he important? And once I could get the question down, that's when I could start. Once I could figure out what the question was I wanted to answer, that's when I could actually start doing whatever research that is. So, I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
Mike, your Schofield masterpiece was the Beehive. How did you start that one?
So our lodge has roughly 500 members, but it's due to a couple of lodge mergers. So Verity and Lincoln Lodge, and a lot of guys were kicking around the idea of putting together lodge histories or things like that. And that entire time, my goal was to try to get more of the old Lincoln and Verity members back in attendance. At least the group of core guys that were there to, that had to make that tough decision to merge. And the one thing that always goes around is, oh, hey, this is lodge tradition. This is lodge tradition. Well, when you're getting lodge tradition from Jefferson Lodge, Lincoln Lodge, and Verity Lodge, is what the new tradition becomes is a mesh of all those things. And so that's kind of how I came up with the Beehive is our working lodge is a mesh of those other beehives, if you will, together. So on my Beehive, I presented a logo too, and it has 3 beehives on it, and each of those bees represent those other 2 lodges.
The question you wanted to answer was what is a symbol that we can all that is
trying to
something that we can use to start our new culture, or what?
Yeah.
I completely understand where you're coming from, bringing those three together. Why the beehive? Why was that the one
Well,
you
just
latched
just
onto?
because of the beehive being representative of a working lodge. I mean, and
Okay.
we're a busy lodge. We do a lot of good things. There's things that we could definitely improve on, but that was part of my goal as I was approaching the East, was to try to get more in attendance. And I'm sure David would argue, because we usually have 30 to 40 guys in attendance, but to me, percentage wise, is that's about the same as all the other lodges in the area. So my goal was shooting for more, and to show that we work together, we are one hive now, kind of thing.
So the research you did was a lot of kind of researching your own lodge history, plus researching the characters of the lodges that were coming together. Was that what it was?
Well, so mine was actually more of a compilation of how the beehive was actually used throughout history too, and that's kind of how I tied it all together at the end. I even talked about how it was used in astronomy, how it was used for buildings, um, even how it was perceived in dreams. So I just kind of did a mesh of all the things that I could find, anything on how it was used symbolically, um, and just tried to compile that information together. I sought out Schofield Society to begin with, was because I didn't feel like I was getting what I was looking for. Uh, so a lot of the Schofield stuff I did on my own, especially the traveling. Had I not bumped into Taylor and David a few times, and each of those connections led me from one place to another as far as the Schofield stuff. So what I was doing was kind of a surprise to everybody, especially when I had it completed.
Gotcha. But the questions were kind of what started you and kept you going. Now,
Yes.
Taylor, yours, I got to be honest. I'm bringing up the Schofield because that's the first time I remember actually seeing you do. Um, your masterpiece was right sizing your lodge,
Mm-hmm.
and you were kind of applying. You're applying some different principles. Basically, it was a lot of making very conscious decisions about like the placement and arrangement of things within your lodge to affect the lodge experience. If I remember right, you're bringing in some pretty broad concepts having to do with, I mean, from a theater background, I'm thinking of things like, how things are placed. And, that's what I remember about that experience, or at least your presentation. So I guess with that one, how did you start that? Was it a question or was it a purpose? Like, what was it that started that journey?
So my background, academically, prior to going into chemistry, was psychology, with a focus on pre-med. And so I've studied a decent amount of psychology, and a lot of those principles seem to apply to lodges. And the structure of a lodge, in like a broad sense, seems to incorporate a lot of, maybe not intentionally, but it's successful because it captures a lot of these, it promotes eusocial behavior through its structure, through its etiquette, the way the lodge is set up, a lot of the things that have historically been done in a lodge, tend to make lodges successful, right? And so some had to do with singing, how do you set up your chairs, what kind of signals are you priming people for, and it really kind of started with kind of applying my knowledge base, to understand what a good lodge structure was, because I come from a struggling lodge, and some of these things kind of made sense that going through the traditional observance movement and reading some of the material, like, yeah, these practices make sense, from a sociological and psychological perspective. When I joined, I think Cliff Porter's book, The Secret Psychology of Freemasonry, had just came out too. So it's kind of an idea I've been playing around a lot with. And Chad Simpson really said, you should give a presentation on this. And then he named the presentation, and that's kind of what gave it its kind of direction, and kind of focus.
But again, I'm putting words in your mouth, but it sounds to me like you also had a question you were trying to answer with this, right? Like, basically, how does this all work, or how does this apply, or does this
That's the
make
first
sense?
one. How does this work? And then generally applying a different set of lenses to that question, right? So, psychologically, how does the lodge create brotherhood? How does the lodge, what makes the lodge successful? What are the things we can do to make that work? And I think that if you look at our lodge structures, that they are pretty good at creating a sense of brotherhood relatively quickly. They're also good at expanding that sense of brotherhood to unknown individuals and their connections. And so what you see in the fraternity and a lot of the really kind of crazy stories you hear about us, crazy in a good way, right? But like kind of like, wow, I can't believe that happened. Usually plays on the small world effect and kind of a network theory, scope. And, I think that oftentimes we kind of miss some of the things that we put into place that are best practices for some lodges aren't best practices for other lodges because they don't capture the psychological and social function for that lodge. And that oftentimes it's glaringly out of place for those reasons. If that makes sense.
So, but it sounds to me like you had a question about your own lodge, but then it ended up leading almost to more questions, with the result being that there are certain things a lodge should be asking or should be considering. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to figure out, what Freemasonry is about. My education going through it wasn't great. It was memorize the catechism, start learning your ritual as junior deacon. But there was a brother, who was wide read and introduced me to some books and things, and ideas about finding answers to your own questions. And so, kind of as somebody who's just kind of out in the wind, like Mike, you were when you joined, you kind of find your place, fairly quickly.
If you don't know where to start, is it just being able to articulate that question of what do I want to know? Is that too broad?
What is research? I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to ask here. And I think your point is absolutely correct, that research is simply answering questions. That's the ultimate goal here. And it kind of also goes back to that principle of write what you know, right? Don't try to create something. If you're a farmer, don't try to build an airplane. If you don't have basic knowledge about a topic, then it's probably not the right place to start. Now, if it's something that interests you, obviously start building that base of knowledge, but that's an entirely different endeavor. If you're trying to answer that question, if you're trying to do research, you start with something you start with a question that you have that presumably either hasn't been answered or hasn't been answered satisfactorily. And ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to put truth to that question. And I think in some ways, at least in my mind, that's where this concept of Masonic research is wide open, because for centuries, for lack of a better word, we have been developing the organization on traditions and perceptions rather than on facts. So anytime that we can put facts to those, you laugh every time I talk. That makes me a little curious. But it's not that the facts don't exist. It's not that it's not on a good foundation. It's just that we often don't know what that foundation is. Right. So when you can start putting facts to those questions, and you can start putting facts to those traditions, and you can start explaining why those perceptions exist, now you go beyond that realm of beliefs into reality, for lack of a better word.
The reason why I laugh, Dave, is because it's those two competing forces in Masonry. We are a hierarchical, authority driven organization, and by and large we very often are just this is the way we do things. You just don't question it. But then there's also part of us that just by nature as an organization, we're supposed to ask why. And so it's those competing things. I'll be honest, so much of my own research when I first started was that saying, well, wait, why do we do that? you're saying that this is tradition. During one of our degrees, there's a part where an area gets searched, and my district does it a really specific way, where certain guys go in certain areas and say certain things and do certain things. And I'm looking at that going, that's not in the ritual. Sure it is. I'm like, no, swear to God, it's not. Why are we doing this? That's the way we do it. And then it was just kind of, well, how do other people do it? Well, why? Again, that question of why. And it wasn't to be a jerk. It was just to be like, you keep telling me that you keep telling me that this is the way it is and just take it. And but you're also telling me to understand and, inculcate these lessons. And so it was that weird sort of push and pull. And what ends up happening is you realize that the reason why we do it that way is absolutely arbitrary and silly. And that any reason is just as good as another for us to do it. And, if lodges want to keep doing it, God bless them.
When somebody claims that they are doing research, effectively what they are doing is going against the common belief, right? They are challenging what is accepted. And whether you go back to, being a scientist, whether you go back to Galileo and Da Vinci, or you come forward to Feynman and Mullis, these are guys who really created a lot of stir in the world because they didn't accept what was believed at the time. Now, it turned out that they ended up being right. So history, put them in the win column, and it is now as accepted. But there are just as many people out there who didn't end up in the win column, who were doing research and trying to figure out what the answer to that question of why, you're trying to figure out what that question, or excuse me, the answer to that question is. And that's kind of ultimately what we are, is, at some level, if you are starting to do research and you're in the Masonic world and you're starting to ask these questions, you're kind of a rebel by nature. You're kind of asking, in some way, you might be asking those questions that a lot of people don't want to ask. Not that they shouldn't be asked, not that they're necessarily even bad questions. They're just questions that, we live in a world where people like things. They like when things don't change. They like that even keel. They like that there's a word I'm looking for that my brain isn't coming up with, but you're looking for that commonality. And when you start challenging that common theme, you often meet with resistance. And that's kind of oftentimes where we're at, I think.
And you're not going to find the answers because the answers don't exist. And what does it really affect my life today? Who cares? And I always want to say, well, that's not really the point of research, is it? It's not really the point of this whole endeavor, right? I'm asking the question because I care, because I want to know. I'm asking the question because it kind of gives me a way to kind of understand the way that Masonry works and the way that I fit. Like, satisfaction isn't necessarily the point of this, or usefulness isn't necessarily always the point of this. See, and now Taylor and Mike are both nodding. So you're nodding. I'm making you guys talk.
No, I agree. It's understanding and finding the answer for yourself, and having the ability to seek out that answer and find it. I did a lot of that stuff when I was looking up the founding members of Jefferson Lodge to kind of find out, well, what happened to them? How did they stay involved and active in Middletown? And the majority of them didn't. So I get it. I looked for probably 4 or 5 years before I finally found our first master of our lodge. So
you're in physical therapy as a profession. What is something that you ask patients to do today to help them to improve in their current medical situation that 10 or 20 years ago would have been laughed at as unthinkable, as harmful?
Drink water, stretch.
Wow, that was much easier and simpler than I thought it was going to be. Yeah, and the point I was trying to get at was that, things that, 10 or 20 years ago was thought to be just crazy. The fact that you would tell someone to drink more water, how things that seem obvious today were not obvious in the past. And the one that's popping into my mind that has nothing to do with physical therapy, but based on something I recently read, when we talk about women in pregnancy and how important breathing and that is. And 40, 50 years ago, that if you were a doctor and you suggested to a pregnant woman that she start practicing her breathing, they would have literally laughed you out of the room. And now we understand that it is such a critical part of the process. And so that's the kind of looping this all back together, at least in my mind, is that, when you do research and you ask a question that you think may only be important to you, you have no idea what those connections are going to be. You have no idea how that's all going to fit together. And, that might spark an idea in somebody else's brain, and it might lead down these other pathways. And, 6 months, 5 years, 10 years down the road, well, your little question may have been the spark of something that was very important and very significant that you didn't even think about. That's why you need to ask these questions.
I mean, I think it's really curiosity, and just being curious about something is a good enough reason to research it, right? I mean, for the most part, we're not out here asking for grants. We're not trying to figure. It's not like we're asking a grant from the NIH to solve, cancer, or anything like that. That if you want to spend your time researching because you find that fun, or you find that person, interesting to you, that's good enough. And that we should do more things like in that manner, right? That kind of idea of playfulness.
Same thing. Like, it's the idea of, you get so worried about getting it right that sometimes you can't start, or you get so worried about, like, this must be absolutely, spot on perfect, that you don't take that first step.
It's a puzzle, and not like a jigsaw puzzle, but something that's complicated that you have to play with in your mind. And the benefits of thinking and sorting out through these issues, they're not always immediately apparent. And some of these skills that you learn through these, quite playful activities are useful in other circumstances that aren't always apparent or aren't always immediately, clear, right? And that's part of it, is that the payoff isn't always known, and you have to allow for that uncertainty in your life. That part of the beauty of symbolism is that there is uncertainty in what things mean. That why question is, we might get a response from somebody, why is this the case? And they might give us an answer. It's not satisfying. And that gives us an opportunity to go look into that and develop our own understanding and deal with the uncertainty around what's being said. And that research is really about how do you deal with uncertainty and learn from it, and then kind of apply these same kind of ideas in a wider kind of stance. It's not always clear, what the payoffs are, but they're definitely there. It's definitely valuable.
We're not asking these questions because they're going to change the world, right? We're asking these questions because they're interesting, because they're intriguing, because maybe they're simply just fun questions to ask. But to your point, we don't know what path that question is going to take, and what path that answer is going to take after we ask it. How it travels from person to person to person. In the end, it may or may not be life-changing. It may or may not be changing the world, but it's worth asking for the simple fact that there's the chance that it might. That alone is the reason it's worth asking the question.
And sometimes that research does pay off, or it brings up things that have been ignored or weren't visible.
And that's usually how I start research anyway, is that, while looking up one question, I'll come across something else that will lead me to my next question of what, and this is why I never finish anything, is because the one question will lead me to the next.
And it was the fact that I had a date that I was giving the presentation that made me kind of wrap it all up, and kind of modify it without a hard deadline. I cannot finish research at all.
Our limitations are our opportunities.
Thank you for joining us on this edition of OLR Connections. We hope you have enjoyed our thoughts and ideas as we have discussed topics relevant to the Ohio Lodge of Research and Masonic education in general.